Welcome to the latest edition of Are You Live? And tonight we are joined by a fantastic special guest, one of my favorite people in the world. I would say he is maybe my longest term supporter and someone I valued tremendously, Nick Gillespie, who is now editor-at-large at Reason. First of all, what the hell does that mean? What is an editor-at-large?
It's a term of art that can mean a lot of different things, but at Reason, what it means is after I started at Reason in October of '93 as an assistant editor. At that point, we were just a magazine.
Wow.
And I became editor-in-chief of the print magazine in 2000, was there till 2008 as editor-in-chief. Then I took over the website and launched the video platform up until I think it was 2017, 2018, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ascended to a place where I merely produce content now and I don't have any management or administrative tasks left.
Wow.
So editor at large in the parlance, and anybody out there who's ever, been a boss or an administrator, the parlance that we were using of the short term was that, I no longer change diapers. I load them. All I do is create content
now. You fill the diapers.
That's right.
Okay, that's
yes.
good. So you have found your rightful place in society.
Yeah, it's I realize this has nothing to do with anything, but I'll tell you, of course, because the grass is always greener. The minute I gave up management, which I'd been doing, on and off, because before I became editor-in-chief, I was a managing editor, an executive editor, et cetera. For something like I've been at Reason for, 26, 27 years, or coming up on 27 years. And for about 24 of those, I had some kind of management or oversight duties. And the minute those went away, I was like, God, I really miss that. So
I'm sure.
Yeah,
And now you have Catherine Mangu Ward.
Yes, she's our editor-in-chief of the journalism division, and she oversees the whole Megillah, the print magazine, the website, the video platform, and our burgeoning podcast empire. So
right. So you also belong here because you have a PhD. A lot of people don't know that.
Mm-hmm. I try to bring it up within 5 minutes of every conversation I have, both with random strangers and new people I meet. There's a great moment. I dislike Catcher in the Rye a lot for all sorts of reasons, but there's one moment in that where Holden Caulfield is going on about his pimply-faced roommate Stradlater, or sweetmate, who he particularly hates because he's Catholic. And he says, Catholics will always somehow work into the conversation. The first time you meet them, within a couple minutes, they'll ask something which reveals that they're Catholic, and they want to find out if you're Catholic. And I'm that way with, I was raised Catholic, so I enjoy that because it's totally true, but I'm that way with the PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. As you should. You should laud that over everyone you meet.
And by the same token, I want to point out that there is nothing worse than PhDs, and I would go so far as to say medical doctors, who insist on being called doctor. And if we need any reason to vote against Joe Biden, it's the fact that his wife, Jill Biden, insists on being called Dr. Jill Biden on every mention. And her Twitter handle is Dr. Jill Biden. So right there, I think he should be kept out of elective office in public life.
Why did you have to give me another reason to dislike Joe Biden?
Yeah, well, they, once you start, they just keep piling up.
He is special.
It's like a dream catcher. You just put it in the window, and it's going to be full of stuff. Sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Joe Biden is definitely my dream catcher. So you wrote a piece in Reason, I think it was early on in the quarantine, I think maybe in the first week, right? When you went to Whole Foods and you talked about how nice everyone was to each other, and there was a lot of basically mutual aid going on in New York City.
Yeah.
And how is it now? What is it like in New York City?
Well, the amazing thing, and I was born in New York, and I was raised in New Jersey. I worked here and lived here before leaving for 30 years, and I moved back here, I don't know, like a little bit less than 2 years ago. And I've been coming to New York, I know New York well. And it is striking now just how empty the city seems. And
Mm.
it is both kind of beautiful and deeply haunting,
Mhm.
because when and Thad, you've been to my apartment. It's on Bleecker Street. I'm in what's called NoHo. It's kind of a fake designation. It's the Lower East Side, by Bowery and Lafayette avenues. And I mean, there is nobody around, and I'll go for walks throughout a good chunk of Manhattan, sometimes 3 or 4 hours on the weekends, and you see, a dozen people or something like that. It is,
Wow.
it's strange and discomforting in many ways. There is also a kind of aching beauty to it all, because and we might get into this in a kind of mythic level. New York has more people in it now than it has ever had. It's like
Mhm.
8.6 million people or something like that. But it's over for New York, and it's been over for New York and America, I think, in ways that are not bad. It's just that these hegemonic places, I think times have moved on, and it's a haunting beauty to see that. Having said that, in terms of people interacting with one another, um, something happened to New York during the course of the 90s or early 2000s, and it has turned into a very nice city after being a mean, nasty city. And that was the city I remembered from the 70s and in the 80s. For a good chunk of the 80s, it became nice, more than a decade or two ago, and it remains that way. So, and one of the things that's fascinating here, as well as other cities, there has been no spike in crime.
Mm.
The one caveat to that is that there's homeless people or bums, street people, homeless people have mostly disappeared, but there are just piles of human excrement everywhere.
Oh,
But having said that, in terms of crime, nothing, and people are getting along. People are fine.
piles of human excrement? Why?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You know,
Uh-huh.
I'm going to leave that to the, I guess the cultural anthropologists.
Yeah. Why do you dislike Catcher in the Rye?
I've, uh, holding call. Well, okay, I mean, I guess to put it into a context of when you start to talk about post-war American culture, and that book came out, I think, in '52 or so, and there is this immense move towards individualism and a kind of really, I think, fascinating kind of interrogation, analysis, creation of alternative culture. You see this with the Beats, see this with certain kinds of jazz music and other forms of music. Catcher in the Rye is about a die. A death comes up. It's a common theme in everything I talk about. But it is rooted in a culture that was dying, a kind of elite, upper class,
Mm.
state establishment kind of culture. And it's unironic about that. It's not looking at why that culture is breaking down and how that affects the
Mm.
people within it. It's kind of a last gasp celebration. I find Salinger just to be a fundamentally uninteresting writer who wrote about mostly uninteresting people compared to all of the other weird, wonderful stuff that was going on. The narrator is annoying, is frustrating. I think the world that mostly takes place in it just doesn't have much of an interest to me. There's no world building there, and there's a kind of recognition that something isn't working, but there's no interest or ability to start looking around to see what would be better.
My 19-year-old self is deeply offended.
Yeah, yeah. I
I
mean,
haven't.
I don't. It's weird. This type of stuff is. It's mostly personal. I do think, obviously there is disputing taste. That's what, I was trained as a literary critic, and that's the whole point of it. But it's just not very interesting. And then Salinger as a figure, as a kind of author figure, is also, just an uninteresting version of the author.
Huh.
His compulsive privacy, his true weirdness in an odd way. I mean, he became a kind of Buddhist or Hindu who started drinking his own urine. The most interesting thing about him is that he became obsessed with the B-level TV actress Elaine Joyce and followed her around, to dinner theater in Florida and things like that. But I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know, like being in the 60s and being like, my favorite band is Herman's Hermits or something.
Uh,
It's just, it's dull, it's uninteresting. There's so much more interesting stuff going on.
huh. For those of you who don't know, Nick knows everything. That's just a quick introduction to him and his. It's true. Your breadth of knowledge is unsurpassed among people I personally know.
Okay. Well, I thank you, I guess.
That includes me, and I know like almost everything.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I only know like the bare minimum about a few things. So
Really?
yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that, but that you think that. But I mean, one of the few things that keeps me going, and it's, I mean, I don't, and I'm curious what other people are thinking, just kind of psychically, not psychologically per se, but psychically. This is, a difficult moment. One of the things that has kept me going for the past 20 or 25 years is the internet and the interconnectivity. And more than anything at that, I know you're like this, from your writing and the way that you comport yourself. It's so great to live in a world where at every stage you can find out more information and more connections and more stuff and
Yeah.
stumble. I mean, I feel like I am, walking down the street, trying all the doors to see which ones are which ones are unlocked and I can pass through. And I'm going to find, that room or that apartment, that suite, that Andy Warhol factory of the mind that is going to propel me for the next 20 years and bring me into some place that I didn't even know existed. And it's going to become the center of my universe. So much easier to do that now than it was 20 years ago. But having said that, this lockdown is punishing because it strips away human interaction in a kind of profound way,
Yeah.
which
Yeah. Let's talk about that. So is it hard for you? Sounds like it
yeah,
is.
yeah, it's another thing that is kind of curious or paradoxical, I think, is for most of the past 25 years, which is, a fucking long time when you think about it. But I've been working from home or split between an office and, I'm working from home. Reason is based technically in LA. We have a big office now in DC, but I was living in LA in the mid 90s, and my wife at the time, now ex-wife, got a job teaching at a college in Texas, in a prison town, Huntsville, Texas. And we moved from LA there, and we started, I started telecommuting and working from home. And basically, I've been happy that Reason not only talked about this stuff as a kind of ideological gesture, but also walk the walk. We've had a distributed workforce for, a quarter of a century, basically since it was kind of technologically feasible. So in a way, there's a roundabout way of saying that, in a way, my day-to-day life isn't that different now than it was for the past
Mm.
quarter century. But after the end of work, things are very different. The blur of, the week into the weekend,
Yeah.
and obviously, I mean, in the Renegade history, you talk, in various ways about the kind of creation of the work week and of the weekend as something
Mm.
distinct from that.
Mm.
I realize these are artificial structures, many of which have pretty odious origin stories, but nonetheless, it's a way that we kind of, compartmentalize so that we can actually get some energy and get stuff done and reward ourselves, et cetera. And the new word now is blurs day. Every day is
Mm.
blurs day. And
Mhm.
I don't know about you guys, I'm like, wow, I haven't eaten in 2.5 hours. I'm looking forward to having that fourth fourth breakfast or something. It's
Uh-huh.
just, it becomes very difficult when you're in this kind of lockdown to create structures that allow you to think, recover, produce, etc. And I'm a kind of, I don't know that post-capitalism is quite the right word. I mean, I believe in capitalism on some level, but I'm also, I don't deify it. I don't, I'm not a Protestant work ethic person, but I
Mhm.
like being productive. And I find, this is a real challenge to productivity.
Really?
Yeah,
I've actually been much more productive.
yeah.
I think we should
How
all.
come? How come?
I want to always be in quarantine. I don't know. It's forcing me to do work, and there's just fewer distractions. Simply, I mean, that
Yeah.
boils down to that. I mean, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to hang out. I can't even go to a cafe and work. So I just have to sit here and do the thing all day. My productivity's gone up quite a bit actually
Well,
the last 4 weeks.
all I can say is fuck you.
Yeah, I know. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. However, this will make you feel better. My happiness has not gone up. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
my mental health has certainly suffered, like I think probably most people. I am not enjoying this. I miss people. I miss certain things that I used to, like the gym I used to go to all the
Hmm.
time. I mean, yeah, thank God I live in East Bay, or I live in the Bay Area where there's like hiking trails and nature
Right.
available. If I lived in New York City, I would lose my goddamn mind not being able to get into nature.
Yeah. Well, I want to just point out, and this is actually not for anybody in this conversation, but a friend of mine, it's not nature, or it's nature. It's nature is a man-made construct. The Bay Area's nature is a man-made construct. It's a romantic ploy.
Mm.
So I don't mind being in New York and walking around, an openly terraformed, human constructed landscape. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's just it's rough. It's rough. The sameness of it. It's I one of the things that I did when this started was I started watching or rewatching a lot of bad apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic movies from my childhood, like the Omega Man and Logan's Run in particular, which came out in 1976 and takes place in I don't know if it's a dystopian or a utopian future where if you're over 30, you get killed for the good of the state, and otherwise you live in this giant shopping mall
Yeah.
with really bad science special effects. But we're kind of in a Logan's Run world, and it's the worst of all possible worlds because, like, if you're old, you're still alive, and
Mhm.
you still you just hang out all day. You
Yeah.
don't have to work, and obviously this can't go on forever. But it's like you're just hanging out. You're not really doing anything.
Now wait, I can't let the comment about nature go
Yeah.
like that. That was, you were talking some shit about nature. That hurts my feelings too.
Right.
And that was also very postmodernist, and we don't like that around here. What
No.
what
Yeah.
what what is this? What is this cockamamie postmodernist argument about
Uh,
nature being a construct?
Yeah, I mean, the what we call nature with a capital N, and our interest in communing with it and finding ourselves and leaving the city behind. I mean, it's a historical reaction to the Industrial Revolution, to
Oh,
the urbanization of the world. You don't hear a lot of people in Chaucer. They're not going into the woods to find themselves. They're running from bears and boars and things like that when they're in the woods. And, it really, it kicks into gear with the English and French and German romantics of the early
yeah.
19th century. Which isn't to say it's a bad thing. I mean, it isn't. I was an Eagle Scout. I've camped, hundreds of nights out in the wilds and stuff like that. But I also, I come from all of my grandparents were immigrants here from Ireland and Italy, where they were for thousands of years. They were part of the natural world. And man, I'll tell you, like my grandparents got it right. They moved from the boondocks of southern Italy and Ireland, Western Ireland and Northern Ireland, to a city. And God bless them.
So it's a conservative romanticism, or a romantic conservatism.
That's an interesting. It doesn't have to be conservative, and it's kind of fascinating to think about how the high church of nature,
Yeah.
and certainly things like national parks, that has a left wing progressive tinge to it.
Yep.
There is a conservatism to it, and Teddy Roosevelt is probably a great example to talk about this because he was a conservationist
Mhm.
and a progressive. Nature was seen in an American context, particularly in an early 20th century context. The relief of nature, of getting to nature, getting away from the cities, was also, I think, a marker for getting away from blacks and immigrants,
Immigrants. Yep.
dusky hordes, Jews, Italians, Poles, mix, Irish, Catholics coming and cramming into cities. Where I live in Manhattan, had a population density that was like 4 or 5 times what it is now, where people were crammed into,
Mhm.
1 and 2 room apartments, 5, 10 people at a time. My father, who was born in a part of Manhattan that doesn't exist anymore, the the block he lived on, the street he lived on, the building he lived on got paved over sometime, I guess, in the early 50s for what became Lincoln Center. He was born in the early 20s, though, and he was, he lived in Irish ghettos, both in Manhattan and Brooklyn. He and his friends, for 1 or 2 weeks of summer, in the Depression, they would be bussed up to the Catskills and the Adirondacks to go commune with nature, because it would take, by being around these big tall trees and out in the woods, it would take the grubby, subhuman Irish lower class ghetto kid out of him, and make them pure by communing with nature. That's where it's coming from. And by the way, I'll just add with that, my father, who also served in World War II and liberated some Russian POW camps, he once joked that the camps that they were bused to as kids were essentially like prisoner of war camps, because you left, you got put on a bus. Nobody wanted to leave the city, because all your friends were there, and you would get bussed up to these, places nobody knew where they were, and they had chain link fences around them, and you weren't allowed to do anything on your own. Like, you had to follow orders. So they were like, what the hell is this? That's where my nature phobia is coming from.
I know, it's brilliant, and I agree with basically all of it. Yeah, I know you're right, because I've done some of the research on this and I've studied this stuff. I mean, it's not just conservatism, it's reactionary. There's a reactionary element to it. A lot of it was absolutely anti-immigrant, anti-urban, anti-modern,
Right. Jack London, I mean, if you're in the East Bay, if you're in Oakland or whatever, Jack London, who's one of the great, authors of Nature, Red and Tooth and Claw, he was also that, and he was also a scientific racist who saw the Great White North. That was like, it was white because it was covered in snow, and it was white because it was a place you could get away from all of these other kinds of mongrels that were taking up all the spaces.
And you must be aware of this. I would assume you are, although it's so little known. It's amazing how well they've covered this up. But you must know about the history of environmentalism and immigration.
Yeah.
Right.
And particularly the what is the big group, the
Sierra Club?
I'm sorry, the Sierra Club.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
They were full of anti-immigrationists.
Right.
John was his name, Bauer, the main guy, the founder. I mean, all of them. The board of the Sierra Club was, I think, unanimously anti-immigration until
they were at one point 1 or 2 votes away from making a public statement, basically calling for a moratorium. This, I think, was in the 70s or 80s, a moratorium on immigration, because the country was filling up. Which is kind of amazing when you think about it. And I've spent a lot of time. I lived in a lot of different places in the country, and to keep it in the East Bay, what's her name, Gertrude Stein, at one point said, in America there are more places where nobody is than where everybody is. Or something. I mean, this is a vast, empty, desolate country. There's plenty of room for more and more people.
Mm-hmm. There was there's still like a splinter group that broke off from the Sierra Club that's like, no, environmentalists must be anti-immigration. And they're right. The logic is right? If you don't allow any movement of people, the earth will be cleaner. It's true. Right.
Yeah. This is, I'm starting to see an increasing number of stories about, one of the upsides of the, lockdown that is killing tens of thousands of people is that pollution is down. And that, so the air is cleaner. So, it's like you can't breathe because you have COVID-19 in your lungs, but the air you would be breathing is a lot cleaner.
Yeah, it's another reason the left is not super unhappy about this, I think. And by the way, the Sierra Club story, I believe this is correct. So they were formally anti-immigration, I think, until the 2000s, or at least they were dominated by anti-immigrationists. And then the Democratic Party came along and said, wait a second, we need these immigrant votes. So if you're going to be part of our coalition, get our support, you're going to have to drop that. And that's what happened. So now they're officially pro-immigration, but then a bunch of people split off from the Sierra Club and are like, no, we must be anti-immigration. It's quite something. It's very, very well hidden in the history.
I find that the whole question and the topic of immigration from a kind of mythic level is fascinating, because on the conservative Republican side of things, there's an equal kind of tension where which has faded into being kind of universally or uniformly anti-immigrant on the part of Republicans and conservatives. But for a long time, Republicans were the champions of immigrants because they were small businessmen and they wanted workers, or they understood that like the free movement of people was a good thing. There's a brilliant, if you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out, especially in today's context of immigration debates. In 1980, when the Republican nomination race had winnowed down to George H.W. Bush, who was based in Texas, and Ronald Reagan. It was in 1980, and if you Google Reagan Bush immigration Houston 1980, you'll get this clip where there had been in the late 70s there had been a Supreme Court case saying that public school districts had to educate kids regardless of the status of their parents, their citizenship status of their parents. And it was kind of an issue. And so in one of the debates, this one in Houston between Bush and Reagan, the questioner says, what will you do for illegal immigrants? And Bush and Reagan outdo each other, talking not about legal immigrants, but about illegal immigrants and how illegal immigrants are an essential part of American society and the workforce and the culture. Yep. And each of them tries to outdo the other one to say how they will welcome illegal immigrants into American life because they are the true Americans. And it's like my colleague Jesse Walker at Reason sometimes says, the past is a different planet. And it's like, man, that really comes through loud and clear there. Again, on a kind of mythic level, I think the immigrant is kind of like the wandering Jew in, to think about it, somebody who comes from a different place and then becomes, simultaneously an object of fascination, as well as one of absolute opprobrium, and America is kind of, to the extent that we can talk about a country being great or having a great tradition, part of it is that for in many ways, we've been extremely open to immigrants. In other ways, we have not. And we like to tell a story about this being a nation of immigrants, which is mostly, it's kind of factually true, but it's hokum. We've always hated Asian immigrants at various points. The first mass laws, mass immigration laws were to keep Chinese people out and Japanese people out, and Indians, Asian Indians. An Asian Indian in the early 20th century sued to become a citizen. And part of his argument before the Supreme Court was that he was as racist as any native-born American. He would never, he would never marry a black woman or an Indian because he's an Aryan, like the rest. So it's a bizarre history. But what's great about it is the idea that, immigrants come and we don't know who they are, and they're inventing a story. They're mixing, they're mongrelizing with us. We love them and hate them. We want to eat their food and put them in camps. We want to, sleep with them and have children that look like them. It's great. And, one of the real outcomes, I think the long-term outcomes, as well as near and midterm outcomes of all of this I worry about, is that it is going to harden the anti-immigrant or the xenophobia and the fear of the other that is really coursing through, I think, a lot of American culture, like a coronavirus or something. And I hope that doesn't come to pass.
Speaking of Joe Biden, his ad about how Trump is too soft on China.
Yeah.
It's wow. Okay. So now the Democrats have been belligerent toward Russia for many, many years, and now they're becoming belligerent toward China. I am terrified of them taking power. Trump's bad enough, but my goodness. So let's talk about politics, because you know a few things about politics.
Yeah.
Like what's a libertarian to do these days?
Yeah, that's it's a fair question. I have always thought of libertarianism, and that's with a small l, as a pre-political and certainly a pre-partisan kind of temperament or personality type. Like it has very little to do with anything concrete. Being a libertarian to me, and I guess I've gone through cycles of different versions of this, but it's, that I believe that individuals or that people should be given as much latitude to live how they want and to do what they want. With certain all of the provisos of my fists, my right to swing my fists ending at your nose, and all of that kind of stuff. But like basically, what a libertarian is somebody who thinks that people should not be left alone per se, but should be free to kind of experiment with the world and find out who they are, do what they find interesting, build cities, build communities, build weird religions, and build weird businesses and all of that kind of stuff. This is a roundabout way of trying to dodge your question.
I can see that.
Essentially. And what has happened is that simultaneously in our political, let me put it this way, in terms of lifestyle, I would say that over the course of my life and your life, that and everybody on the call, that generally speaking, and there's periods where it's not going as well as normal, but like, if you take what America was like in 1970 versus now, we are so much more free on every level to live however we choose. And that's partly because we're wealthier. It's partly because we're better educated and we make more choices and we insist on our choices. It's because we're wealthier. And so wealthier people feel kind of empowered to say like, no, I'm going to do things my way, go fuck yourself. And then technologically, it's just possible to do more things. And, and as a result, like we're generally freer. I think we're in a much more libertarian world overall. When it comes to politics, there's a real disjuncture there because this freedom doesn't carry over into the political realm. And, right now we don't have any good choices. The Republican Party doesn't even use libertarian rhetoric anymore. The kind of liberationist left-wing kind of rhetoric that sometimes, and sensibility that sometimes infused the Democratic Party, has mostly gone missing. Everything, and I know you think about this a lot, everything is much more about controlling and regularizing or regulating, medicalizing, making sure that, people, like, everything's in its place and that nothing's getting out of hand. I mean, it's like, I resist the idea of like the nanny state or big nurse from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because I don't like the gendering of this kind of obsession with order and regimentation. I don't like it being gendered as female because it's not women who are calling those shots. It's overwhelmingly, it's people like Joe Biden,
that's right,
and Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi,
that's right,
is part of the problem. But it's like, but this is the problem with politics right now. And I do believe that, just in terms of partisanship and elections, and this is the book that Matt Welch, my recent colleague, and I wrote, like almost a dozen years, or almost 10 years ago now, the Declaration of Independence. Party affiliations continue to lose numbers. People don't want to have one of their primary affiliations be Republican or Democrat. People don't identify in those terms in the numbers that they used to. But the people who are left, and it's about a third of Americans call themselves Republican, about a third Democrat, the rest don't care. The people who are left are dead enders. And these are, the idiots who are going to, make the last stand in Mexico City, against whatever it was, the French forces or whatever, they're staying till the last man, and they're controlling the political process, and it leads us to a lot of bad choices.
That was a fascinating and brilliant dodge of my question. So
Okay.
I'll let it stand.
But no, ask me though, which, look, I mean, what I'll say here is that, there are no good options,
okay,
when it comes to presidential politics. I mean, if you look at Biden and Trump, these are awful, awful people. If you look at, if you look at office holders, nothing good is going on. If you look in other places, like I am both a student of, as well as a consumer of, and a believer in psychedelic drugs. Forget about pot. We won that. And like, you know, what's happening all over the country are movements to legalize magic mushrooms, to legalize MDMA is, you know, is going to go, is in stage 3 clinical trials with the FDA. There's a lot, you can look at a lot of things. There is a massive decarceration going on where after decades of building prisons and throwing more people in prisons, there is a consensus now that we have too many people in prison, and they are slowly, much too slowly, being emptied out. In many culture war issues, one of the things that I think the COVID-19 break or Seshura is giving us is that we don't have to listen to a, you know, a growing chorus of conservatives talking about how online pornography is absolutely the biggest goddamn threat to the American way of life. Like nobody gives a shit about that. And we've achieved almost perfect cultural freedom in many ways. You know, there is a cancel culture. You know, the custodians of the framework of expression, the people who run Twitter and YouTube and, you know, Facebook are pretty weak in the knees when it comes to freedom of speech. But then magically something like Zoom appears and we can have a temporary autonomous zone, you know, on a free platform where we get to talk and say whatever we want. So, you know, in many ways, things are going extremely well. But then when you look at elections, man, it's darkness.
So again, that was all great. I think what happened was you didn't understand my question.
Okay.
The question I intended was, what is a libertarian to do in the face of a pandemic?
Oh, okay. In the face of a pandemic. Well,
yeah, what should a libertarian be calling for, you know, especially obviously vis-a-vis the state?
Okay, so you know, I wrote a couple of pieces early on at Reason, and I'll tell you, like within Reason's ranks, and you can read this is all the published record. There's a real range of opinions, and a bunch of my colleagues. And what was interesting to me is that the ones who are younger tended to be more conformist. That when governments at whatever level started to say, you know what, we're locking things down. You can't do this. You can't do that. This business is closed. It seemed like the younger people were more likely to go along with that. And it was the older people who were more likely to be infected, you know, or hospitalized because of COVID-19 were like, hey, let's slow down a little bit. I question, you know, I don't question the disease. I don't question the idea that, you know, 1% or so, which are the case fatality rates that seem to be coming up again and again. You know, 1% of people who get the disease are going to die. They're overwhelmingly going to be 65 and older and have underlying conditions. You know, that's a real issue and a concern. I don't know that that should necessarily translate immediately into saying, okay, we're going to have a government at whatever level say this is an essential business, this is a non-essential business, and we get to tell you what to do. It's one thing for the government to kind of put forward best practices in public health and say, you know what, social distance is a good idea. Work from home if you can. Minimize trips. Here are ways to prevent either getting the disease or spreading it. I would have liked to have seen a moment where we talked a little bit about that kind of lockdown and whether or not it works. The mandatory, the enforced stuff that's coming, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. I just published a piece today about, you know, Georgia starting tomorrow is opening up parts of its economy. And, you know, the governor there is getting crap even from Donald Trump, you know, who had like suckered him and was like, come on, governors, you know, give me something to work with, and then immediately screws them as is his wand. But, you know, I think it's, you know, it's worth trying at this point. In New York City, a month ago, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, was saying, you know, New York State was going to need 40,000 ventilators and we only have 12,000. You know, where are we going to get these from? As of last week, they did not max out the ventilators. He's actually lent them or given them to nearby states and other places. So there's a lot of hysteria going on. And I think what a libertarian should do in a pandemic is, first off, is seek out like the best information possible, which is hard to sort through because, you know, I know nothing about epidemiology really, but, you know, seek out good information, live your life according to that, and then always question the order that comes to say you have to limit your freedom in the name of the public good or in the name of public health. I mean, this pandemic simultaneously, it both suggests the need for a legitimate state that can exercise power wisely and in limited ways, and the absolute failure of government, particularly the federal government and most state and local governments, to do that wisely. New York acted poorly by most accounts. The federal government, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, screwed up the testing regimen early on. The whole point of that agency is to protect us from this kind of thing. And they screwed up from the get-go. And worse than that, them and the FDA in various ways even said other health agencies and other doctors and things like that, you can't do anything. We have a monopoly on all of this. So one of the continuing theme of my work over the past several years has been the ways in which trust and confidence in major social institutions, societal institutions, including government, including the private sector, big business, including, kind of nonprofit churches and third space kind of organizations, has plummeted since the 70s. For good reason. Most of these agencies have failed spectacularly. They lie, they cheat, they are self-interested in the worst possible ways. But we need to have institutions that are trustworthy and earn our respect and are not, I don't want to say obedience, but our willingness to give them a fair shake. Because one of the things that I found in my work, and this is broadly observed in the kind of sociological and economic literature, is that when people move from a high trust society to a low trust society, they ask the government to have more power to regulate everything that's going on because they're afraid that they're going to get screwed over. And it creates a vicious cycle. And unfortunately, I don't think we're not going to be reversing that trend because of what's been happening here.
Okay. Excellent answer to my question. Thank you. All right, Jason, you have something for Nick or me, or just to say. Go for it. Jason, who's uptown in the Bronx, not far from you.
Actually, I believe Carlos was first, so I'm going to defer to him.
Carlos's hand is not up anymore. Carlos, do you still want to ask your question? No. Go for it.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so Nick, huge fan. You versus Rachel Maddow on Real Time with Bill Maher is one of my go-to videos. The thing I want to
that's my free bird,
Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, New York City is changing. That's inevitable. The thing is, you hear some people saying that it's changed for good, that it won't ever get back to the way that it was. And you live here, I live here, we know what a dynamic city it is. So I'm wondering first if you believe that narrative, that it might never get back. And then the thing is, in the absence of these traditional businesses like restaurants and pizzerias and bookstores and clothing stores, obviously not right away, but at some point, do you think the absence of those things could lead to something perhaps more dynamic and innovative? And if so, what could that look like?
Yeah, the one thing, or a couple of things in response to that, and the first thing, I like I was saying before, I spent a lot of time now walking around New York, and even before this, since coming back here in 2018, I was kind of amazed at the number of stores. How are they paying their rents? I mean, it just seems incredible that they could afford these rents. It almost seemed like a Potemkin, city. But again, there's more people in New York than there ever has been in recorded history. I worry a lot about how many businesses are just not going to reopen. According to a study from a group called the Foundation for Research into Equal Opportunity, most small businesses have like less than a month's worth of cash on hand and like this pandemic is going to shut down a lot of places for 1, 2, 3 months maybe. So there's going to be fewer businesses immediately coming back, and I worry, not because I love small businesses. I love a mix of small businesses and big businesses, but these pizzerias, delicatessens, the small business things might never come back. I am a big fan, or I'm a big believer that what makes New York great is that it is constantly reinventing itself. So I'm not too worried that it will survive. I don't know what form it will take, but I remember New York in the 70s, and there was a moment where in the 70s, some urban historians talk about how a lot of the rents and stuff, like a typical lease in New York is 30 years. A lot of them came up in the late 70s, and all sorts of stuff was going to hell, and New York was in a bad place. And it seemed like the end. I mean, like, my parents left New York in 1967 because the city was done. Everybody knew it was a dead pig that was bleeding out, and it would give off heat and food for decades, but it was over. It was dying. And what happened to New York in the late 70s and then in the 80s is it reinvented itself. You had in the shittiest parts of the city, places like the Lower East Side, you had the emergence of punk and all sorts of ways that were disgusting to the people who remembered New York in the 50s or in the 40s, or they would romanticize the 30s, but something new came out of all of that chaos, and something better. And so, like, I don't worry too much about New York. The other thing, but it will be different. I don't know how to characterize how it might be. The other thing I'll say, though, is that everybody is at a moment where they're saying, this changes everything. I happened to be in New York a couple weeks after 9/11 because Reason was co-sponsoring a conference with the Institute of Ideas, this great British group that came out of the blow-up of a magazine called Living Marxism in the late 90s. These people at Living Marxism ended up creating the Institute of Ideas and Spiked Online, which is a great website publication I highly recommend. But so I was in New York a couple of weeks after 9/11, and everybody around was like, this has changed my life irrevocably. I don't know how many people I said who said, like, this woke them up from the slumber, and like 2 years later, it did change things, but it didn't change. It's never a U-turn. It
Right.
might not even have been a slowing down of where things were going. So I suspect, New York, what is great, I had the honor or the pleasure of living in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia and New York, were the two great colonial cities. Screw Boston. It was always a small town, a provincial town. In the colonial era, Philadelphia and New York, they were struggling. They were the Stones and the Beatles of colonial America and early Republic America. And, Philadelphia lost, and it still kind of looks like it did in 1800. New York doesn't even look like what it looked like in 1980.
Yeah.
So it'll be fine.
I agree.
And people will move on from this more quickly than we give them credit for, I think, around the country as well.
I agree. Having lived in New York through 9/11 and for many years afterward, it was almost a blip, actually, in terms of daily life and real estate prices. Most importantly, because I had just bought a condo at the time.
Oh, wow! I'm sorry to hear that.
No,
that is one of the things that might be good is that there, I mean, every city, every culture, every individual, we need resets. I'm a big fan. One of the reasons, and if we can talk about this, that'd be great. One of the reasons I like psychedelic drugs is that I feel like they reset, they kind of clean out your web browser cache. Like when you've been online for too long and everything, your machine has been on too long and it gets kludgy and slowed down. Psychedelics, I think, mentally and psychologically and whatnot, help clear the cache, and you can start over. Cities, societies, countries, individuals need that periodic break. And you don't want it to happen like this or 9/11 or a financial crisis. But, New York has in many ways gotten into a weird dead end of like where it's so expensive. It's not as bad as San Francisco in this or the Bay Area in this way, but this might reset, prices, and it might open things up for a different kind of groups of people to come here and flourish and have a shot at taking over. A couple months ago, I interviewed Dan Carlin, the guy who does the Hardcore History podcast, and he wrote a book called The End is Always Near, which is about pandemics throughout history. And one of the things he talks about in that book, it's fascinating, is, the Black Plague and the bubonic plagues in the Middle Ages. One of the things they did is they killed off, 2 generations of people who were in positions of power. And suddenly, it was pretty good to be a 20-year-old when the bubonic plague killed all the old people. Something roughly analogous, certainly not as disastrous, might be happening, not just in New York City, but in, throughout American society.
Oh, that's darkly beautiful.
Yeah.
So,
I think I've mentioned this to you, Thad, and I apologize for going on. You've warned people, but I want to be the Quisling of the baby boom generation. I was born in 1963, so I'm a very, at the end of the baby boom. It's a generation that has stayed, it rose to power. It was celebrated when it was in its infancy and its, larval stage. It stayed on the main stage for so long. And it's still there. And it's like it needs to leave the stage. And, early on in the coronavirus pandemic, people noting that it killed older people, they called it the boomer remover. And it's like, yeah, you know what? It won't be a bad thing for a generational power shift to happen, whether that goes to Gen X or to millennials. And I don't take, generations too seriously, but, we are in the double, triple, quadruple overtime of the 20th century, where we are using outdated, just irrelevant concepts to structure our political life, our economic life, many parts of our cultural and social life. And we're in the death throes of the long 20th century. And this might be the type of event that helps us say, okay, you know what, let's just forget about all of this stuff and let's start living in the 21st century.
whoa. All right. With that cataclysmic statement, we're going to go to a private session. I wanted to say before we do that, though, that you mentioned Spiked Online and Living Marxism. I just interviewed Brendan O'Neill, who will be the next guest on Unregistered. Fascinating.
He's worth paying for.
Oh, definitely. Fascinating. Yeah. All those people at Spiked are fascinating and iconoclastic. And I often disagree with them, but I always enjoy reading them. All right. Yeah. So for those of you who are watching this on YouTube and are not Renegade University members and you want to be a part of RU Lives in the future, you know what to do. Go to renegadeuniversity.com and become a member at any level. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to the private session.